Alright, welcome to the next discussion. So today we're going to be looking at ideologies in RP, avoiding traps and tropes, and how ideologies affect your nation overall. And also go along, with some other bits. So those bits are going to be sort of what is an ideology and what does it entail, how ideologies shape a nation and their people, what kind of ideologies are there out there, the big three that you will always find, so democracy, fascism and communism, what they are, what do they entail, and, the like. Meme ideology tropes and how to avoid them, so how to sort of, not be extremely generic, I guess. How ideologies can be changed through direct and indirect action in character. How to create internal conflicts within an ideology, how conflicting ideologies interact and mesh with each other, and unique and serious ideologies. So, to start off with, what is an ideology? And I will read you the textbook definition. It is a system of ideals and ideas, especially one which forms the basis of an economic or political theory and policy. So essentially, it's how your people think on a societal level. So it is encompassing of a lot of different things. It is how your government operates. It's how your day-to-day people sort of as a society think. It usually is how your structure of your nation is. And it can go on from a diplomatic and economic standpoint as well. So ideologies are pretty massive scope, but they're actually quite simple at heart. So ideologies shape virtually everything about your nation, but it usually just comes to just an idea of what or how would happen, or like whatnot, if we followed this particular system of thought. And again, we'll get to sort of some examples of that a bit later. So, how ideologies shape a nation and the people? Well, as said, you have a fundamental sort of, I guess, ideology. And you don't typically just go, okay, this is the ideology of my nation, everything gets built around from there. Ideas, as you all know, are very, very malleable. So you have one sort of, I guess, overarching, well, this is kind of how we have an outlook. Then you're going to have multiple different types of people who are like, well, maybe we're going to do this, but change it a little bit. And you're also going to have lots of different instances where you have to think, okay, if this is my ideology, then how does it affect this part of your nation? Because it will affect literally everything. So from the top down, your ideology dictates how your government works, and how your legislation passes, how your nation actually deals with executive decisions regarding all sorts, how your economics work, and your economic policies. It determines your diplomacy and how you interact with various different... I could hear a dog barking, sorry. There we go. Yeah, it determines how your nation will come across on a diplomatic standpoint. It determines how your economy in the terms of like your private and public sector, and how all of your different like if you even have any corporations, or how your industry functions, how that all interacts with your society, how your people are. It can basically pervade everything from top to bottom. Now, obviously, everyone's not going to believe in the same thing, and you're going to get different sort of outlooks as people do different interpretations, or try to interpret like different aspects of this ideology into your actual nation. But we'll take a pretty obvious and easy sort of example with the USSR, because everyone knows, communism. So the whole thing with, I know we'll obviously get onto like the big three a bit later on, but the whole thing is, to each according to his own. And that sort of, the whole thing of all the workers are going to be in charge. Well, that really sort of fundamentally shaped the entire nation from the top to the bottom. And it really did build itself from the ground up. It started as an ideological sort of movement with all the different, workers in. And then you had a complete and utter revolution where they then took power and built a nation from the ground up around this one ideology. Now, yeah, admittedly, they changed that ideology quite extensively, let's say, over the course of the revolution and the building of the USSR, especially when Stalin took over. But the whole thing is that they literally implemented what this the sort of ideological movement was to every part of society. And if any of you obviously know the history of the USSR, you know it affected even individual people in the workplaces. It affected the factories, it affected the food production. It affected diplomacy on the world stage, especially in those days. I mean, the more traditional nations of the time, like Britain and America and such, saw the ideological movement of communism as such a threat that they actually sent forces to go and assist in the Russian, civil war, essentially, which is quite an interesting topic. I suggest you look that up. But this ideological movement was so big and so profound that it formed a nation and it shaped a nation. And that's kind of like what you want to go for in how it actually will affect your people and how they shape an entire nation around it. I'm not saying your particular nation needs to have one ideology and it needs to literally, foundationally build itself on that from the ground up, just like the USSR did. That's not the case. I mean, especially if you're a more diverse nation, you're probably going to have all the different sorts of interpretations and viewpoints. But you're going to want one particular idea or set of ideas that are fundamental to your nation. And that is going to be, I guess, very similar to your nation's, I guess, like we use the term special sauce. It's a couple of, a sentence or two, which is to say, this is what your nation is. And in that sort of very small amount of words, you have to define your nation from the ground up and encapsulate everything it is in a way that shows off, what your nation is, what makes them unique, what makes them as they are. And that is kind of very similar to how the ideological standpoint is going to come in. So, well, I guess your inverted commas special sauce is going to, go over your sort of, I guess, founding aesthetics and everything. Your ideology is, I guess, the sort of mirror for that, in that what actually makes them tick. What's their belief? What does this nation stand for on such a level that is going to shape them entirely? And it can be super simple. And there's so many ideologies out there. And we're not going to go over all of them in this discussion because it would literally take hours and be pretty crazy. But it does come down to just the foundation of what makes your nation your nation. And if you want to go even further, you can incorporate multiple different ideologies into your faction. And that is something that we'll cover later on and is really, really good for world building. And again, if you have a nation that maybe was founded on one ideology but changed to another, again, fantastic world building. It's always good to have, different interpretations, different ideologies fighting against each other internally. It creates internal conflict, makes everything more interesting, makes everything more dynamic, and makes it seem realistic. Especially when you look at most of the, I guess, Western nations today. Hell, even most of the non-Western nations, even in the Cold War, you had different dynamics going on between, different interpretations of, say, communism and socialism. So, while I guess ideologies don't necessarily determine Jimmy Bob Jones down the local fish and chip shop, basing his entire existence off of. It's more of a macro scale thing. You're not going to, I guess, focus on ideologies much with, I guess, individual characters, although you can if they're a particular individual who is, pushing a movement forward or starting a particular revolution or something. Something on a big scale, story or arc-wise. But ideology is definitely something that you want to have on a macro scale when building your nation. And in my opinion, is definitely one of the founding things that you think about. And if you haven't already thought about it, it ties into the segment of the nation sheet of driving houses of thought. So that is pretty much going to be your ideology. What makes the nation tick? Do you guys have any sort of questions on that front, or? Okay. I'm going to take the silence as everything good. So, big three. Dun dun dun. Alright. Oh no, it's what kind of ideologies are there? Oh god, right, that's right then. Okay, so, ideologies usually come in two forms. There is political theory, and there's economic theory. And while obviously both influence each other heavily, these different types are pretty clear. You've got so many different types of both political and economic ideological theories that there is way too many to cover. We could go over some of the basics in the big three, but I'll sort of go over this from a sort of limited standpoint. So political theory, and in terms of ideologies, is how you run your nation. That's how your government is supposed to operate, and how ideally your society is supposed to operate in regards to what your political system provides. You obviously have, democracy, communism, fascism, and all of the ones in between. There are so many different takes, even on the big pillars of political ideology, that they literally branch out almost endlessly. You have democracy, direct democracy, Republican democracy, you name it, you've got communism, socialism, Stalinism, Titoism, and the like, and then you have the different forms of obviously fascism and everything else. You can get anarchism, social democracy. I could keep listing these off for ages, but you can pretty much find any sort of political ideology on the political spectrum and beyond if you go searching. If you want a moderate left-leaning authoritarian sort of ideology, you can always just look it up. Wikipedia has fantastic lists of all the different types of ideologies, and you can just hi Blue.
Yeah.
You can pretty much look up a political compass and look at all the ones on there. Now, obviously, there's going to be some ideologies that aren't going to be on a traditional sort of modern political compass. Things like hive minds, or I guess what else would be some extremes that aren't really found on the modern political compass? You've got obviously hive minds, which would be ultimate left authority leaning, I guess, or just authority leaning in general, to be honest. And then you can go like super anarcho-capitalism and the like. But again, if you want to go for some of those extremes, you can pretty much just sort of make it up as you go along. The realm of political ideology is so big that you will likely find something, no matter how extreme or crazy or jazzy it is. You will likely find some sort of article somewhere that details some incoherent ramblings by some rando dude in a country that came up with a political theory about a particular idea to base an entire country around. Even if you just look at it and go, how would that even work? Pretty much political ideology in a nutshell. So, yeah, like, go out there. There is a lot of resources. I'll link a couple of lists that I can find and some political, like, compass stuff that will help you go over. But that's the sort of, like, political theory. Economic theory, not really my strong point, I guess, but that is, you know, the ideology of how do you run your economy. Do you have it as a completely controlled system where the state and the political, you know, government dictates exactly what goes where and bases it on, you know, everything that they know about? Or do you have a completely open market economic system where anything goes? If you want to, you know, create something that is needed on the market and you get huge amounts of money over it, cool. But if you fail, you fail. Doesn't matter. Obviously, there's all stuff in between. There's some pretty wacky stuff as well. Just like political ideology, to be honest, there's an entire minefield of different ways of going about things. But they, as I said, they both interact with each other in some degree. Especially a lot of the political ideologies, they very much like to dictate what economic means you would use to implement these ideologies onto a people. But from the economic ideology standpoint, I don't think it's as clear-cut with affecting a political system. Obviously, if you go for a completely closed economy, you're not going to be some, like, open, you know, individualist nation. That's not probably going to happen, but you know what I mean. Blue, you're probably a more economic person on that regard.
What was the question?
That's right. So the topic is currently what kind of ideologies are there? And I was just going over the difference between political ideology and economic ideology.
Well, they go very close together, hand in hand, but economic ideology tends to be sort of a subset from political ideology. Political ideology can be things like, for instance, you can have social conservatism, which is a lot about, you know, these sorts of things about reform, like LGBT rights or whatever, or the role of different genders and things like that. But you can see even in that right-wing sort of thing, if you look at most conservative movements, you'll have subsets. For instance, you'll have interventionism, which thinks that the state does have a role within the economy to different degrees, whether it's nationalizing certain things or having a role in healthcare and things like that. Or on the other side of that, you can simultaneously have within that ideology things like, for instance, laissez-faire capitalism, which I think things like Thatcherism and Reaganism are much more closely associated with. And they're sort of closer to that, but they're not quite the same thing as laissez-faire. So economic ideology is not necessarily concrete with each thing, but they're very tied to it. I'm not sure if that answers what you're trying
No,
to get definition of. But
that's pretty good. It is something definitely to put in, is that, you know, even if you see a particular ideology and you're like, that kind of fits for my nation, but it's not quite there, you are more than allowed to basically just, you know, change it and just call it another, like, ideology, because that's exactly what happens in real life. You have people that are like, oh, well, I'm part of the, you know, the liberal movement, but I believe in this, that, and the other, and then it's like, okay, but then under that you have even more, which is like, okay, you have, you know, different people who go, okay, that's a pretty good idea, but what if we instead did a little bit of this, and then they then rebrand the ideology into something new. It can be pretty expansive, so even then, you could just create your own. Again, we're going to get onto some, like, created ideologies later on. Hopefully Victor will be here for that, because he's pretty, like, well, he was the one who helped make most of them, but yeah, so I guess that sort of counts for that question. Does anyone have any sort of questions on that type of thing? I'm going to guess not. Okay. So, now it's the big three. Dun dun dun. Okay, so when RPing, you are pretty much going to come across, as harsh as it is to say, an absolute metric ton of pretty generic nations, which you will obviously sort of encounter both in character and out character. And this doesn't just sort of like go for Anserios, this goes for just RP in general. Many people like to stick to the basics, because that's what they know, that's what they're familiar with, they kind of know how it works, if I'll be very sort of patchily, and that's what they want to go for. So, the whole thing, you'll most likely find big open democracies that are like sort of the United States or the United Kingdom or whatnot. You'll find herder Mr. USSR in space with space communists, or like space socialists or whatnot. And then you get the personal favourite of all RP settings, the big fascism, Nazis in space, that's so monumentally overdone. I don't think I've yet come across an RP group that didn't have space Nazis or space Third Reich. So the key is knowing what the big three are, because they're what you're going to encounter the most, and what they entail, and just some differences that you can do with them, because just because you want to play a democracy, or just because you want to play communists or socialists, or just because you want to play fascists, doesn't mean that you have to fall into like the sort of regular tropes, which again we'll get onto in a bit. So pretty much we'll start with democracy. I'm not going to explain too much, because I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with democracy. If you're not, then I'm surprised you're in the group, and that you don't have your internet monitored on a regular basis. But pretty much, people decide who come into power. Doesn't even have to be the people deciding necessarily. There's some funky things that you can do in that regard. With democracies, you really can do all sorts. With big open democratic nations, you can pretty much go, I can have all of these different ideologies because everyone's free to think what they want to think. Or you could go with a different route and have it be a democracy, but have it be sort of controlled by the state. Or you can go something crazy like some AI direct democracy, where all the citizens are constantly voting over individual amendments, even as they work and go about their day-to-day lives through AI uplink chips. It's like kind of watching Prime Ministers or Senate question time 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Which would be pretty cool. But democracy is your pretty much bread and butter. It could be done in many interesting ways, and again, I'll link some pretty sort of unique ways to do democracy in the write-up. But democracy is the one that gives you quite an open book to do as you choose. And there are so many different ideologies for democracy that if you do try to look for some obscure type, you're probably going to find it, because, you know, someone in his shed somewhere in Barcelona has come up with some fantastic new way of how to interpret people's votes on the political scene, you know? Blue, do you have any interesting things to say about democracy? Or Vic? Oh, Vic is here.
One thing I'd say about democracy is that it's typically like accepted as sort of the most moderate between the two, but like across the entire spectrum, most countries will call themselves democracies. And even as you go further left and further right, they'll still, and go closer to communism and fascism, they'll still insist themselves being democracy. In fact, they'll be more democratic than what we traditionally associate as democracy. So, like Marek says, you get all these different variants along this entire smorgasbord through the spectrum of different factions that call themselves democracies, even into the other members of the big three. Democracy is such a juggernaut thing. You can't just say, "Oh, I'm a democracy," and expect people to know what that means.
Yeah. You've got to really sort of, if you're going to be playing a democratic faction, you really have to sort of narrow it down into what makes your faction's political ideology unique. Because just saying we're a democratic nation means absolutely bugger all. You could be the Democratic Republic of North Korea, or you could be the United States, or you could be Brazil. So, you know, um, there's really all sorts that could be going on with democracies. So it's very good to refine. If you're going for something as open as democracy for your nation, you want to ideally refine it down to one sort of major ideology with several more that are outlying. So you have different ways of thinking competing within this democracy. Just like how in most Western nations today, you have different political parties. Well, I was going to say vying for different political things, but that's not really the case anymore. But you know what I mean.
We
You
live in a
have,
society.
yeah, we live in a society. Yeah, pretty much different political parties jockeying over control of this democracy with different ideological takes on the situation, but are not necessarily radically different. They're just different takes on the same system. That's the best way to go about things if you're going for the more moderate role. So next up is my personal favourite, good old communism. So
You missed the part about democracy. I think there's
go
one
on,
part about democracy.
go on.
One thing that matters in democracy, if you just have a system where people vote and they elect leaders to power and those leaders pass laws, is exactly what institutions are most powerful within the democracy. So everyone goes to vote, but and they elect the representative. However, people are lazy and they'll usually not go to vote unless they're like pushed to or organized by some other institution. This can be a church, a trade union, a company, like the military or something. And if they are all organizing huge numbers of voters. So if you have a trade union that says, okay, I have 100,000 voters in that are part of my trade union, and I can suggest and I can mobilize them, I can pay buses, and I can just to get them out to vote. If you push pro trade union like laws, if I get you elected, or a church can also do that. Like, okay, don't like pass anti-abortion laws. If you pass anti-abortion laws, I will make sure that all of these people that follow me and all of the other churches that are associated with me, we all like get together on a Sunday and go vote. And that way, institutions can have much more power than individual voters in a democracy, and that will usually kind of shape what kind of democracy is. Like I said before, if your churches are really like well networked and organized and have tons of money, they'll be able to push towards like sort of religious conservatism or Christian democracy or all that stuff. If your trade unions are really strong, then they'll be able to push towards like social democracy and trade unionism and whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. That can really help, especially flesh out a political system from the ground up.
Yeah, in a series of like two examples of that, which is both Capital and Criterion, which are countries where there are huge trade unions, and they have like tons of the industry mobilized, so they are able to just get the state to do whatever they want, like the integral cooperative, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a pretty good add-on, I think. So back to communism. It's pretty much all you ever need, and that's the end of the discussion. No, so the whole thing with communism is power to the people, power to the workers, etc., etc. Everyone usually plays space USSR, really. They always have, huge states with masses of starving people and huge military and, big industrial output and all that such. But again, just because you're playing a communist nation, there are lots and lots of different takes on, the hard left. You can have all sorts. I mean, look at, say, Cuba or like Czechoslovakia when everything was going down. They changed their outlook pretty interestingly. And while they were ideologically very far left wing, they still made different steps than, say, the USSR took. Even in the USSR, I might add, there were loads of different ideologies of how to take the direction of the country. I mean, you had Lenin, you had Stalin, who completely took it in, a cult of personality type way. Even Gorbachev and all the likes of the different leaders, there were all different opinions in the Communist Party of the USSR that were trying to, push and subvert the state in different directions. And again, sort of, as Vic said, they had different sort of, influences in different institutions that could push and pull for power. While it wasn't through voting, it's through influence and party influence. So, with communist nations, you can have, your big, grand central party within your nation, but then that central party can be just as split up between different ideologies as any democracy. And then it's up to those different parts of the party to fight over, who actually gets to steer the nation from the top down.
I have something to add to that.
Yep, go.
Okay, so communism isn't just like power to the people, the working class. That's just kind of the motto. But the idea, the central, or I guess it's the central idea behind communism is that the workers are getting something called surplus value stole from them. So a worker works at a factory where he receives sheets of steel, and with like a bunch of hydraulic presses and like hammers and stuff, he shapes them into plate or an engine or a car door or whatever. And that car door is worth more than the steel that it was originally. So there's this like extra value that he has created through his labor. And the thing is that he does not get that value. He gets like a little wage, and the person who actually gets most of that value is his boss, which is sort of the person who owns the factory he's in, who pays the bills for the electricity, who owns the machines and whatever. But he doesn't work, and he does not himself add this value to the steel by making it into cardboards. Communism says that the workers are getting their surplus value stolen, and that the ideal society, like communism is kind of goal-oriented. They say that the ideal society in which that would not happen is a stateless, moneyless, classless society where there are no longer distinctions between people who work and earn a wage and people who just own a land, and those things produce value by themselves. And there's like the different currents within communism say, okay, part of that surplus value that is stolen goes to the bosses and the bourgeoisie use it to create things like the state and the police and the military and whatever, which they use to like cement their own power and prevent us from taking over the factories and whatnot. So a question within communism is what exactly, for example, is the role of the state? Because there are some that say, okay, the state is just it's a purely bourgeois creation, an institution that does nothing except sort of placate us or repress us from getting our stolen value back. So there are communists that say, okay, there shouldn't be any state. And in an industrial society, there should be just this huge uprising that tears down the bourgeoisie, collectivizes the means of production, and then you end up with a classless society. There are other instances of communism, such as in the USSR and like China or whatever, where the country itself was too primitive and like there were just like goat farmers and had no industry whatsoever and no proletariat. So this, okay, there is no way that we can now make the transition to communism, to this supposed ideal class of society, because we don't really have workers. We don't really have like industrial workers. So we need to get in the state and use the state as an instrument to like forcibly industrialize ourselves, to like organize a whole bunch of like projects and open new factories and do infrastructural development and whatever. And the state is the only organization that's powerful enough to do that because it has the police and the military and whatnot. So if we take over the state, we can then use it to develop ourselves to a state where we can actually go and make the transition to communism. And that was sort of the whole Marxist, Leninist side of it, I guess. And there are others, currents of communism that say, okay, no, that's the state is just only bad. So the organization that we're going to use to take power and mobilize ourselves is, for example, going to be the trade unions. All trade unions are going to come together, and then we're all going to overthrow the state and sort of organize ourselves according to the unions. Then there's like, I guess, more radical or like esoteric forms of that are sort of anarcho-communism that does not want the state either, or market socialism or whatever. And then there's the question of exactly how do we know that the people are okay with us? And some say, okay, people are just inherently okay with us taking power because we share the same class interests. But then you got stuff like democratic socialism that says, okay, to enact a revolution, we need to make sure that we have the support of the people, and the way that the people are going to show that support is by voting us into power. Then we're just going to peacefully take over the state and use the state to develop ourselves and establish communism. So yeah, there's like all sort of variants around of communism based around exactly how developed the country is. Because communism in like a super developed, nice country like Iceland, it's going to be something different from like Cambodia in the 1960s. And yeah, I think that that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think that covers it quite now.
I also want to add on top of that, sort of, there's a lot of differentiations and ideology of how to achieve it. I know it's sort of been touched upon, but there's one of the big ones that comes to mind is also the role of sort of nationality. I think that was the one that Ho Chi Minh broke away a lot from, in that he sort of put more emphasis on sort of the Vietnamese people and the idea of continuing sort of a patriotic culture, while I think other ideologies put much more of a dismissal to the idea of nationalism and things like that.
Revolution, yeah.
Or internationalism. And there's these sorts of things. Yeah, there's this sort of dispute between sort of, I guess, nationalist socialism and catering for the people of the nation to these nations are just constructs, and the workers are international, they're global, or in this case, they're interstellar and stuff like that.
Definitely. And we do actually have some examples now in Serios of states that are the equivalent of, well, you know, the workers of the galaxy, irregardless of what species or, you know, who they are, we're all just one people, and we should rise up and create a, you know, stateless, utopian communist society in, you know, the galaxy or whatnot. So, you know, just because you have Herder Space USSR does not mean that you can't have pretty awesome different types of, you know, hard left nations to go out and do interesting things with. And again, you can have moderates, and you can have, you know, your hardline, crazy, fucking, you know, USSR on crack dictators. That's all fine. But there is definitely a much more broader choice set on the sort of, I guess, hard left, where people always just go towards USSR communism, that can be done and interpreted. So I guess that just leaves our be-all and end-all favourite. Do you want to talk about your favourite way of thinking, Vic?
Fascism? Or what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With strong individual liberties, I might add.
And maybe blues, but it's like better at introducing fascism. Is what fascism actually is.
Well, yeah, it's a very like the one thing I'd say about fascism is that with socialism at least and communism, it's much more easily defined by the end goals of there's going to be a classless society and all this kind of thing. It's sort of how we get to those or what means we use. With fascism, it's much more of an umbrella term for independent reactions to things that are much more contextual towards a specific nation or culture. Because if you look at actual fascist countries in history, you'll notice that each one of them is rather unique in each way. But like generally speaking, fascists are very right wing in the sense that they're very reactionary. They want to reverse a lot of rapid social progress and things like that. And they put an emphasis on restoring traditional cultural values and things like that. But at the same time, are extremely adaptive towards populism and anti-elitism, and put an emphasis on the common people and things like that against sort of capitalism and things like that. So, for instance, you have Nazi Germany is the classic one, but the Nazis, I'm sure people can agree, sort of radically sort of vary from something like Imperial Japan in the way that they approach things. Nazism was anti-monarchist, they were anti-church in many ways, and they were, by their very nature, anti-sort of foreign. While Japanese, while they were brutal with their military, they didn't call themselves fascists or national socialists or anything. They were just sort of very nationalist, ultra nationalist, and yet both of them are referred to it. So that's the one thing I'd say about introducing fascism, is that it's a very right wing thing, yet there's so many ways that you can define it. If people want to like sort of identify it much more easily, I'd suggest looking up, I think, fascism. I'll type it in chat, but like there's one guy that sort of gives some sort of principles, that like 12 principles that can be used to identify a fascist state. But yeah, that's what I can say for like, without going on even more tangents that probably confuse people more than they resolve it.
No, I think that goes well. I would say as well, sort of linking in that like each sort of I guess fascist nation is very much unique. One of the core like sort of elements with these like sort of fascist uprisings and ideologies, especially when they're trying to gain power, is they will say sort of whatever they can to whoever they can in order to bring them onto their side. Especially in Nazi Germany, the National Socialist Party pretty much said whatever they had to say to whoever they had to say it to in order to try and get support. On the one hand, they were talking to, the industrial trade workers and saying, like, oh, well, yeah, we're going to help you get all of this nice stuff and you'll be able to have all of these massive, wage increases and the like. We're clearly better than the communists, but we're also, pretty left-wing ourselves, But then on the other hand, you have them talking to different people and saying, like, oh, well, you've got to watch out for those trade workers because, otherwise they might steal all of your well laid money, and if you vote us in, we'll make sure to keep them in line and stop your money from getting taken. You can't trust those communists. So it's kind of a thing of, as I said, it's very sort of populist and it's very reactionary for what happens, so that they can try and just get into power. Another thing with fascism is, at least, I guess, in the principle of our own timeline, it's not a stable ideology. Now, a big thing, and we'll get onto this in sort of like the meme tropes, is people make fascist nations and have them like very old. Like they've existed for huge amounts of time. But most fascist nations actually don't tend to last very long, because they tend to collapse in on themselves through their own machinations, where either people just don't care about the plights that sort of existed when those particular individuals came to power, or things start turning a lot more sort of, I guess, liberal inherently as they try to regulate the economy and whatnot. And that's kind of interesting, especially if you look at the likes to fascist Spain. They're kind of one of the examples of a very fascist nation that came, out of a revolution and a civil war, and then sort of didn't get taken down, say, at the end of World War II by, Allied invasion. They sort of fell apart on their own accord through internal matters. So fascist Spain is like a good example, in my opinion, to bring up on that regard.
But, yeah, the thing is, I'll mention sort of fascist Spain as well, is that that goes to my point of how it's difficult to define them, because even though they're very nationalist, I don't think people would call them as fascist as Italy, even though they were very closely associated. And similarly, even further away, Portugal, under the Estado Novo regime, and I think Brazil as well, were under the governments of very nationalist, conservative, militaristic people, Antonio Salazar in Portugal, but they were even less so, yet they're also considered fascist because of the sort of rhetoric and sort of policies that they used. And one of the things that I posted in the chat is sort of identifies that. It's sort of, they identify themselves as anti-ideological. Many fascist, in fact, fascism itself, especially Mussolini, referred to it as the third way. They considered it away from rightism and leftism, and instead a direction that utilized aspects from both sides. Mussolini himself was, I believe, an anarchist for much of his earlier life.
He was everything at one point.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's like they adapted things, and Mussolini, of course, introduced, I think, national syndicalism and national syndicates, which itself is a development of syndicalism, but with nationalist, authoritarian sorts of tendencies to it. Yet at the same time, he became pro-monarch in a way, and pro-church, in which they co-opted those established elements in order to gain power through establishments. Yet despite being anti-establishment, so they co-opt different groups, both the status quo groups and the sort of masses, by utilizing a rhetoric of both ways and trying to act as an anti-ideological one that doesn't identify either way necessarily. So, of course, Hitler, in many quotes, called himself a socialist and for the revolution, yet in other quotes, he said, if I'm a revolutionary, I'm a revolutionary against the revolution. There's these different quotes, and this is something that can be taken away. If you want a clear-cut idea of what fascism is in paper, I'd suggest looking at Mussolini's writings, but it's generally a despotism that doesn't introduce elitism or, oh, I'm better than you, into its rhetoric, unless it's against minorities. But it says, I'm the people, I'm the common man, and tries to involve them in the state.
So yeah, fascism's pretty an interesting umbrella term, but
I forgot to add something to that, which is, I mean, Blue kind of alluded to that, in that fascists, like, they're obviously against the revolution. They are for the sort of social hierarchy that is, but they also believe that the extreme of the social hierarchy, just this unbridled consumerist capitalism that just leaves a ton of people completely dispossessed and a few hyper rich people, is also bad. So they try to like strike sort of the middle direction, especially because at least according to some of them, the bourgeoisie, like the real, like this elite rich people of a country, can also tend to be sort of degenerate and more cosmopolitan. So they forget about a lot of national working class values, and they just assume this sort of globalized identity that doesn't really preserve the national sort of spirit. So they want to strike a sort of middle ground between communism and capitalism, And they usually implement this, at least in like stuff like Spain, Italy, and Nazi Germany, by grouping up all productive forces into corporations. But there are corporations in sort of a different way than we think of corporations. They are more like these state-backed industrial entities whose role is as much to produce profit as it is to like maintain full employment or give people like jobs, even if it's not the most uh, profitable thing to do. You know, to keep everyone sort of in line and in their place, sort of knowing their place, and through that way avoid social conflict and the spread of communism.
Yeah,
And
sort
those
of.
corporations like tend to be like really state backed, and they tend to do like stuff which the government can just pay them to do, like infrastructure or military developments or stuff like that. And they usually like get really heavily regulated by the state.
Like I'd build on top of that. I'd say, like you sort of said, corporations in this context. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word corporatism, mean, oh, it's also like a state run by corporations. In real life, that takes the old, like the core definition of what a corporation is, which is a collection of people, to like the Corporation of London is a place in London. It's like a borough, and that's what it uses. It uses the core term and says, oh, it's a collection of people working towards this, and we're working as one body effectively. And a difference with fascism and communism is that fascism, you can't have libertarian fascism really, because fascism puts an emphasis on the state. Despite being for the people, they say, because their interpretation is the state and the ideas of like the derivatives of what the state is and what that word means is the public. It's the public control. If something's state owned, it's controlled by the public. And so the state is the people. And so empowering the state is everything. And one of the things, for instance, to back that is that when Hitler came to power, despite having the support of industrialists and so forth, one of the first things he did was pass an article that completely prohibited private property in one of the things. Everything became owned indirectly by the state. And even though most of the industrialists that support the Nazis were still remained in power, they became augmentations of the Nazi party, of the state, and the cause of it. So everything centralized itself around the party, which itself called itself the state, which itself was considered the people. So everything hinges on this one, I guess, the ultimacy of the state, because the state itself is perfect. It's the people, it's the nation, and the more you power that, the more we can help the people equalize things, stop people acting greedily, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that encompasses it pretty well. So here's my question to you two, Blue and Vic. Would you consider the monarchism and the whole thing of, you know, our big old favourite of sort of imperial families or you know, monarchs to be a sort of ideology that would go into the sort of big commonality to talk about?
I mean, I don't think Vic wants to go say anything quickly, but I was going to say monarchism is an interesting one in that even with communism, there's a subset of ideology that was monarchist. It's really strange, but monarchist can be something that hovers above, especially democracy and fascism, and yet also be its own ideology on its own in some cases, not so much nowadays. But it can be monarchies and imperial royal families and stuff are less of an independent sort of construct to how to run a state as much as a pillar
of a state.
Of a state. So you can have, for instance, absolute monarchy, in which is the most like classical idea, and it's really sort of overdone, I would say, in a lot of stellar empires, because it's typically a state government that sort of originates itself from a time that was popular, like in the medieval era, and then towards the 1700s, and they were so popular during that time because mass politics was not a thing. Most people at that time did not care about who was running them. They cared about whether or not their beetroot harvest was going to come out all right. That was their only concern. But as time went on, those phased out. So monarchies became integrated into democracy with either semi-constitutional monarchies in which they had limited powers, or constitutional in which they're basically ceremonial, fascist in which they were more like a figurehead of this traditionalism that we said that fascism is associated with. Or you can have like theocratic stuff in which they are still absolute monarchies, but I guess in the modern day, in which they try and utilize sort of the population by associating themselves with the monarch. This is something they did back in the medieval era, but I'd say it's the one way that you can sort of make a monarch who has absolute power still work. Because you see in Japan in the 1900s, the monarch is absolute. He is God himself, or he's associated with spirituality and all this, and he's not even a common person. Because if you make a monarch the average person, then people ask why is he governing things without us giving permission, you know? But like that's one thing I take from monarchy. It's not necessary. It can fit into everything if you can give it the right justification. But really, don't just make it on its own, because it doesn't work very often.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I would not say that, monarchism or having big imperial families should be your ideology, because that kind of doesn't actually dictate your ideology, because you can still have fascism or, as I said, as Blue said, some versions of communism, or a democracy that can have a monarch or an imperial family, and, that can be defined in another way. So, yeah, I think we're probably getting to the point where we can talk about meme tropes and ideologies. And I think, monarchy is the sort of, one of the big things that it isn't really a defining point of your nation. And it is, big absolute monarch nations, which is, I guess, the Empire from, Legend of Galactic Heroes and such, where you have this big, established, absolute monarch who controls everything and their word is law. It's obscenely overdone, and it doesn't really define the ideology of your nation. And, again, it would just be so unstable that your nation would just fall apart really, really quickly, because who in their right mind in the modern day would support, a monarch who is ruling them? They have no say in how their nation is run, they have no say in their policy, they have no say in their day-to-day lives. It is all just, no say on who the monarch is. It's just, here's Dave on his throne, and everything he says goes. You've got to have an ideology that is built in such a way as to justify a monarch being in power. It's not the... Go on.
So I was also, I think this might diverge from what you might be going to say, Marek, but I was going to say on top of that, the emphasis is ideology. We're talking about ideologies right now.
Yeah.
And when we talk about monarchs and monarchism, they're not really an ideology apart from the idea of whether or not we should have a king. And most modern day countries, even in Britain or whatever, there isn't a monarchist party. There isn't some popular group that puts the monarch, the idea of having a monarchy at the center of its day-to-day things. It can be pro-monarchy or it can be republicanism. But the idea of having monarchy isn't really something that is a pressing issue or concern for most people, because you can have a monarch who is extremely nationalist. You can have a monarch who's extremely militarist, or someone who's really progressive and wants to give loads to the people and hates corporations, or a monarch who is really hedonist and he doesn't really care at all, or he wants to kill everything, or he hates a minority, or all this different thing. The reason why most people aren't really that monarchist is because it's an institution, as we pointed out, that can exist in other countries, in different government styles. It's an institution rather than a construct for state governance in and of itself. It's sort of just something that can exist within a state, and you can make an argument whether or not you want it from, oh, it's part of our heritage and it's a part of that, or oh, we don't want that, it costs too much or whatever, or we don't want to pay for that. It's not really a comprehensive manifesto like communism is or fascism is on its own. It's whether or not it's just, should we have a person in the state who has a royal family and all that or not? It's not really a manifesto or an ideology.
Absolutely, I'd completely agree with that, and that's pretty much where I was going. Is the fact that the ideology should shape the existence of a monarch, not the other way around. And I noticed this again. This is kind of another meme trope with RP. You get like monarchist parties in nations, and it's like, but the nation doesn't have a monarch, and it's like, well, why would you vote to create like a monarchist, nation when that hasn't existed before, or whatever. But anyway, so yeah, that's pretty much how we should go for monarchy. So I guess the next sort of like really silly ideological meme trope is, I'm a democracy. You've got the Democratic Party, and then you've got the evil Nazi Party and the evil Communist Party. That's not how it works. That's never been how it works, and just stay the hell away from that trope. If you're going to run a democracy of any kind, you need to have political parties and an ideology that overarches for all of them, that makes sense for your nation as a whole, and for your people in that nation to realistically believe in and support. For example, if you are a more conservative nation, your main political party is probably going to be a normal sort of conservative party who, kind of wants to keep the status quo, keep things running, etc., etc. That's fine. However, the Progressive Party is probably not going to be some ultra, hey, let's change the entire system from, the top down and redo everything so we're this liberal hippie democracy. They're probably going to be very similar to the ruling party, but they just want to make a few changes in their, specific case. Then you might even have a more radical traditionalist party that maybe wants to undo some of the changes that the Conservative, who are currently in government, have implemented, and go back a bit and re-implement the good old days, etc. So you need to have political parties, at least main political parties. You can have funky, mean political parties in the wings, but they're going to have like 12 people from like Studley fucking voting for them, So it's going to be a case of, you want to have your ideology, you want to have your main political party who is going to be the ones in charge, maybe who follow that ideology, or a change of, and then your other main political parties are going to be somewhat breakaways from that particular ideology. They're not going to be massive radical departures from your entire society. Your communist democracy is not going to have like alt-right fascists be part of it or something, or your massive fascist right-wing dictatorship is not going to have literal communists in like the wings where they have 40% of the vote or something. That's just never going to happen. So if you're going to be a democracy, please try to make it more moderate in how your political parties operate, because if you're in a democratic nation like the UK, for example, at the moment, we have, the Conservatives in power. We're not going to then have literal USSR communists and Adolf Hitler as like our main political opposition, who are getting, 20% of the vote. Nobody's going to go that reactionary crazy left or right in response to some of the happenings. So make it moderate, make it believable is my advice on that front. Other meme ideologies. Vic, go.
I mean, kind of depends on what exactly the political situation of the country is. You could have a really polarized society that has Adolf Hitler and communists. I mean, like the Weimar Republic was pretty much that. You had the KPD that were like full communists, and then you had the sort of more reactionary side, and then you had the Nazis, which themselves had like sub factions with different and radically different sometimes ideas. So I don't think you should just homogenize everything, but at least make it believable that there's people in whose interest is that this party wins. It's not the Democratic Party, free money for everyone, and then the well, fuck you in the ass party.
Yeah.
I'll build on top of that and say, I think, in my opinion, and this is an opinion, I think, one of the big things that determines sort of how radical these parties is sort of the electoral system that you utilize. One, like in America and the UK and things, we utilize an electoral system that basically means that only two parties can really exist, because everyone has to compromise so that at least a left-wing party can come into power, or at least the right-wing party can come into power, because other parties continue to just go down the drain effectively. And then alternatively, like say the Weimar Republic and quite a few states nowadays have proportional representation, which is it doesn't sort of throw small parties into the dirt. In fact, it gives no reason for people to really compromise on their beliefs or their personal voting tendencies, because every niche party can get a chunk of the parliament and things and have political power. And so, in the states where traditionally leftists would probably go, all right, I'll vote for the centre-left party because all the moderates vote for that, and there's a chance of getting into power, and they'll get some stuff for us. They'll nationalise a few things in power. They don't have that within those sorts of states in a proportional representation thing. They can vote for their own party, and then they can form a coalition and things. So it's all a lot more fragmented. So it really depends, I think, on the electoral system, and also the sort of the health I'd refer to of the society that you're currently in. In a society where things are stable, there's not outrages or anything like that. It's quite a rich and developed country. It hasn't just come out of a war where like the military and stuff are there's a very real possibility that even the average Joe, if they could mass themselves enough, could take over things. If that doesn't exist, then most people won't suddenly be like, we need radical change and we can do it. We can overthrow the government and have this. I can have all the things I want for my country to change, but they won't be like that. But if there is, then that will be the case. But if it isn't, then most people will be like, I'll content myself for voting for this, and we can get change down the line and slowly guide things in the way I want. So it depends on stability, I think, and the stability of both the state as a whole and the electoral system.
Yeah, I think that's cool. So another sort of like meme trope, which is considered the holy grail in Ansarios, is ultra-authoritarian nations with strong individual liberties. This is a firm favourite of ours because it is literally overdone to the point of like, well, it's sometimes very hard to find nations that are not like this. Even in Ansarios, we have quite the selection. If you have an authoritarian nation, whether it's right or left, doesn't matter. You can't just have all of your people be running around with, casually saying what they want, doing what they want, and be free to believe what they want. Because could you imagine, in this example, the United States as it is now, with all of its diverse opinions and freedom of speech and everything, suddenly turning into the Democratic Republic of North Korea style government overnight? What do you think would happen? It would absolutely tear itself apart. It would tear the government down in several days. And that's exactly what would happen in any sort of government where, I'm free to say and do whatever I want. But, hold on a minute, nobody is in power that I want in power, and I don't have any say in how the country's run, and I don't have any say on who the leader is, and I have to, support this particular party or, movement or corporation or whatever, and I'm, essentially having to do all of this, but somehow, I'm still allowed to say and do what I want. I mean, if you have total freedom and yet your country isn't, free, it's not going to last long. A system like that would fall apart extremely quickly. Especially when you have the whole, but, they love their leader. Well, okay, but that doesn't mean anything. I mean, Blue, you had a very good example of the sort of Nuxit situation, where even if, was it Cyprus? No, it wasn't Cyprus, it was Malta, who literally had the best relations with the UK that you could imagine, fought and bled alongside each other, brilliant diplomacy between each other, UK helped Malta and did everything for its infrastructure and everything else, fantastic. Did Malta vote for its independence? Yeah, they did. But why would they do that if they love the Queen and they love the UK and they've done all of this stuff with them? Well, it's because they want to be free. They want to have their own independent identity. And that's the same thing that's going to happen with any sort of nation where you have the freedom to be able to go, you know what? I actually don't think this way. And I'm willing to make a stand about it. It would get torn down overnight. And even if it didn't, and it somehow stayed together, Romando... Oh, did it vote against independence?
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
But admittedly, the thing is, though, it had less than 50% turnout vote in Malta, and it was very close. It was I think, in the 50% area for. But that's it. It's a small island with 200,000 people on it, and it being in the empire, it had originally joined the British Empire voluntarily. It had been in multiple wars of defence. It had constantly got that. And only then, for this tiny speck of an island, it barely was okay with joining it. But there's so many other places, like the Caribbean islands, Cyprus and stuff, that had the same thing, and they went against it. You could say so many different places. India, we built the railways in India. Does that mean that the Indians wanted to remain part of the British Empire? Because that was the exact same argument that was made for Nuxit or whatever. That we invested in infrastructure there, and they were still, and that's much more closer to that case than Malta is, because India is a huge population centre. It's a huge country. It's not a single island with a small population. It's a country in and of itself, in that it's got cultures within it. It's got all that kind of thing, and it was only taken over properly a little over a century before, and all that kind of thing. And there was basically no loyalism apart from some elites for continued union. And so you can't make the argument of, we invested a lot into that empire, and suddenly their national identity's gone and all that kind of thing.
For sure. I was going to say, Romando makes a very good point, that even if you do somehow, let's say, everyone is supporting of this super authoritarian government, okay? Because the leader that is running it is super mega ultimate. He's like the Messiah, mate. Everything he does is perfect, okay? Well, he's still going to die at some point. So, rip, I guess? I mean, maybe his son isn't the best person? What happens, And for people who might say, my leader is a immortal super wolf who can't die by any sort of means like that. Yeah, but the moment you make a mistake as a leader like that, and you allow your citizens to have open discourse, it's all over, mate. because you could be the best leader for 40 years, making every single decision perfectly in your nation. The moment you make one massive wrong decision, like, I don't know, choosing to go into a certain war, and suddenly millions of your subjects getting killed, their families dying, worlds falling, etc., they're going to remember that, and they're going to go, well, whose fault was that? Oh, it was our grand mega authoritarian leader that we've been supporting all of this time, and they're going to put his fucking head on a spike, powers or not. So the whole authoritarian with strong individual liberties just simply doesn't work. And even if it does work, don't expect it to work for much longer, let's just say. It's going to be very unstable, or in a short time frame.
Yeah, like, one addendum I will say is that the only way, if you do want to, for whatever reason, go for authoritarian with strong individual liberties and stuff like that, you can have authoritarian, not totalitarianism, but authoritarianism with individualism within it and strong elements of that. But most of the time, it's limited to economic stuff. You can look to China. China's clearly authoritarian, but since I think the 70s, it's done a lot of economic reforms and liberalizations. It's still most of their companies or big companies are still state control and stuff, but they've got economic zones and stuff. Pinochet's another example. He was an authoritarian dictator, but he passed a lot of liberal economic reforms to sort of laissez-faire stuff. So it wasn't a command economy. You can have authoritarians that are hands-off, but you cannot have authoritarians that accept things like political criticism towards them en masse. When that happens, and the only time that really happens is when the dictator like Mao is doing it so that he can trap all his dissidents and then immediately purge them all. There's nothing to gain for them to do that. Why would you give your people that kind of individual liberties? So even at the very maximum of authoritarianism with strong independent liberties, it's really just, okay, you can set your own businesses up and things like that. That's the max you can go for. And if you want to go down that route, you can do that as a way of ventilating public discontent, as opposed to the more conventional, oh, well, we're going to shoot them all. But you can't just have like a democracy setting under authoritarianism. I think that's trying to go for the best of both worlds, of the cool, like, imperial state, but also my intuitive attachments to goodness and, democracy and all that kind of thing. You can't have that.
For sure. So, does anyone have any sort of, I guess, ideological meme tropes that they want to talk about, or shall we move on to the next subject?
I have a meme trope which I hate.
Go on.
It's the okay. So you have your authoritarian ideology or whatever, and one trope that I hate is that you write everything as such, like it can be no other way. All the authoritarianism is necessary for their survival and whatnot, which is kind of like you're kind of pigeonholing yourself into having only one ideology and no internal opposition whatsoever, because there's this evil, this absolutely mindless evil that's attacking you, and the only way to survive is just to okay, we have to be authoritarian with strong individual freedoms and follow the wolf god or whatever. And I think that's pretty crap, because even real countries that are at war and are involved in the military things are going to have different ideas about when to retreat, whether to negotiate or to press on the war, what's going to happen after the war, what are the how much are we willing to sacrifice our freedoms in order to win this war. And badly written nations just tend to kind of brush that aside and say, no, if we ever had any sort of political freedom or any discussion about what we're doing, then we would immediately just die. The demons will kill us.
Yeah.
Another one I'd want to add as well, this isn't necessarily authoritarianism and that kind of thing, but a meme ideology is for militarism, like a full warrior society and all that kind of thing. It's not necessarily bad, but you need to be able to interact properly with it. The meme ideology is particularly militarist or warrior societies and things like that don't go around saber rattling or anything like that don't act militaristically. It's all about honor, and we put an emphasis on being able to fight to the death and fight against the dishonorable and all that kind of thing. But then when they get into RPs and things like that, they'll quickly be, because of their out of character predispositions and concerns and things, not want to throw themselves headstrong into fighting this faction or honoring this alliance. It doesn't work. It's so popular to have the warrior society, but it's such a meme thing because so few people are willing to actually interact with their faction to others appropriately to that ideology, I think.
No, I'd agree. Like, you get so many instances where you have these big bad warrior species who hype themselves up to, we're super good at fighting, and we have all of these amazing capabilities, and we've got this massive strict honor system, and we fight amongst ourselves and our nation for all of these honorable things, and then it's like, oh, okay, well, there's a situation in character where there's, possibly going to be a potential conflict in this diplomatic situation where the warrior culture is going to be offended and they're probably going to want to go to war. Oh, wait a minute, it's just been diffused. Wait a minute, there's another, conflict here and they're not really, doing anything about it because they want to be friends. Okay, it doesn't really translate well in character. And in the same regard, at the same time, you have the other spectrum where people play warrior cultures or whatever, and they just throw themselves into any conflict, and it's like, oh, well, my casus belli is I'm a warrior nation, and therefore I like to have war. Look at the Klingons in Star Trek. They're a whole warrior species, and yet they don't just mindlessly throw themselves into conflict. They still know how to do geopolitics. They still know how to, interact with other nations. But they go to war when it suits them. But they don't just randomly throw themselves into conflict, but they also don't just back down and completely show their bellies when something doesn't sort of go their way. They'll be defiant about it, and they'll, probably make a political situation worse, but they won't just be like, oh yeah, let's be friends, that sort of thing. No, I agree.
The one thing I will say, as well, is if you want to be able to go down that route, so the militarist, either fanatically militarist or expansionist or warrior sort of societies, I would implore people, if they want to go about it in a non-meme way, to look at some countries, in specifically the modern era, particularly Imperial Japan during the early 20th century, to interpret how they use foreign policy and things like that, and how they act as a nation and an ideology, without it being completely nonsensical. Because when you have that sort of society of warriors, you can't just back down and make a diplomatic resolution if the people are craving for that war, going, yes, down with them, and all that kind of thing. You even have generals and stuff completely acting out of their own way and effectively engaging in war against other countries, and the state itself cannot just back down, because by the very nature of their sort of ideology, they can't just go, we're going to make peace with this one because we can't manage it, or something like that. It doesn't work like that.
So, would that be it for meme ideology tropes?
I'd say so.
Cool. So the next one is how ideologies can be changed through direct and indirect action. So this is kind of very simple, but also very complex, in that, the basics is, yes, you have a belief system that is the core for your nation, and the core for your sort of political, how they carry everything out. It can change because of internal and external influences. At the end of the day, your ideology is not some inflexible pillar of sort of how your nation acts, but it is a way of thinking that can be changed based on what happens. So your nation, like a sort of very basic example is your nation fights a massive war, and they lose a shit ton of their resources and soldiers, and because of such, the people actually become quite resentful of the government. So the government and all of the other political parties, say if this isn't a democracy, have to try and change their ideology to match this new sort of post-war situation where they have to try and placate the people. They have to try and deal with the devastation that's been caused by this war. If the war was caused by the government itself, well, that's probably the government out of power, and the opposition parties have to try and forge a way to make themselves look desirable. We're not going to make that choice because we're anti-interventionism, or we're going to go back and kick the shit out of these guys even harder next time because the government that was in power wasn't strong enough, etc. That's the sort of like really bare bones. There's always going to be external context and happenings that are going to affect your nation on the stage. For example, with like the Union after 2AW, they became kind of isolationist for a bit in that they turned away from a lot of their 2AW allies because they didn't really trust them after some of the actions that they took in the war, and they wanted to try and focus on themselves more economically. When previously they were very interventionist, if anything was happening in the galaxy, they'd jump in and be like, haha, we can fix this and we can help out, and they'd deploy military forces. But in this time period, they were like, oh, there's a massive ethnic conflict in the Emerald Republics. Whoops, not our fault, and they just stepped back and just allowed it to happen. But that wouldn't have been the case had Second Anseros War happened. And then you have sort of indirect causes, I guess, which can really be anything. Just the changing state of the galaxy, I suppose. I bet you guys have more detailed things to say on that front, but...
And how can ideologies change?
Yeah, like through direct and indirect action.
One way that ideologies have historically changed is when one social class takes over the other. Like, for example, the European sort of bourgeois liberal caste, which ended up taking over the role of the old noble aristocracy in the of the feudal system. So there's going to be a point where like there's this caste or a social class of people that are going to say, okay, we are the ones contributing like most of the wealth of this kingdom. So why do we still have like this noble guy over us that's taxing us? So they're just going to organize together and overthrow the government and replace it with something that fits them more. So instead of feudalism, you get like either constitutional monarchies or liberal democracies, which are like more adapted to the interests of the new ruling class. And like in the idea of communism is that the working class just does the same to the liberal bourgeois what the liberal bourgeois did to the old aristocracy. So you can have just internal revolutions that are not just bad guys versus good guys, but two castes, because there's also in sci-fi there tends to be a lot of factions with like castes and like social strata, but the social strata just like always stay in the same positions. But in reality, the social strata are always trying to move over one another as a group and to push their class interests, whether it be through politics or through like revolutions.
I guess a good example of that would be like the upper middle class and the upper class.
Yep. Well, in real life or in like
in real life,
right?
yeah.
Because the upper middle class is also in capital the ones behind the integral cooperative.
Exactly. So it works in character as well. But yeah, so pretty much something happens. Ideology has to change to satiate the population or the current economic or political situation that the nation now faces. Ideology changes, stuff happens, new ideas and ways of thinking and societal change happens. Another good example of in character, I guess, if Sakura here doesn't mind me using it, is the nation of Atlana. They wanted to help out in the First Anserios War. They were kind of peaceful anyway, but they saw that the Immortal Empire was this massive threat, sent a load of their forces that they kind of hastily put together to go and help. They got absolutely massacred. Suddenly, the leader of the nation just got absolutely, garroted, essentially, and the new government and revolution that came in effectively just went, we're getting rid of the military, we're never going to have a situation like this again, we're just going to rely on external sort of allies for our protection, and we're just going to be completely neutral and pacifist for the rest of our lives, and rake in sort of money through just being a stable island in the middle of a chaotic sea. So yeah. You can also have, and I guess this sort of meshes into the next question of how to create internal conflicts within an ideology. You're going to have constant internal infighting, even in the most staunchest of fascist or communist or authoritarian nations. You are always going to have different driving houses of thought that have different takes on the same principle ideology. So if you ever see the whole, as Victor said earlier, meme trope where they're like, oh, well, authoritarian nationalism or whatever, authoritarian thing is the only way, we can't have any political discourse about it because if we do, we die. And therefore, everyone believes in the same ideology and the same way of doing things. It's never going to happen. Even in these big, super homogenous nations, you are going to have different groups of individuals within, the party or the corporation or the state that are going to be like, well, actually, I think we should do it this way, either, in a more controlling fashion or a less controlling fashion, or, maybe we should liberalise the economy a bit, or maybe we should clamp down on the economy even more, or maybe we should fund the military more, or maybe we shouldn't, or, there's always going to be different takes, and even in, using the USSR as an example, even within the Communist Party, there was so much political intrigue, backstabbings, killings, purges, all because people started to think differently and go, well, maybe we could do it this way. And either the ruling party officials were like, fuck no, purge time, or other members of different cliques were like, hell no, we need to silence these guys because they're obviously thinking differently. There's going to be power struggles within said monolithic entities of the state or whatnot, and you're constantly going to be having conflict within such, just for minor differences. And it's the same in democracy. I mean, Jesus Christ, you don't need any more sort of examples than the UK and the United States. They're both, the sort of inverted commas, free Western democracies, and they have shit tons of internal conflict within them, just through economic standpoints, political standpoints, societal standpoints, you name it. There's going to be people who want to beat the shit out of each other over it, and you're going to have riots and whatever with external and internal factors that are going to come along and cause people to think differently and therefore come into conflict with either the established status quo or other people who want to try and implement a different system than your own.
Oh my god.
Are you okay?
Another thing I would say about internal conflicts is a differentiation. And this, like Myrick said, is that it sort of exists in everything. But historically speaking, I'd say there's two ways you can have internal conflicts. You can have I'd say internal conflict of method, which is more like, for instance, communism. How do we achieve it? And this is where a lot of the sort of and opposition within these sorts of countries appears. Or in Japan, it's like we all support the emperor, but how do we get the things that are best for Japan? Some people wanted diplomacy, or some people, there was this very real difference of factionalism built on, the army wanted to invade Russia and get the resources of Siberia, and the navy wanted to invade the East Indies and all that kind of thing. So that's in a militarist faction. You had internal conflicts of method. You had in the Nazis. Meanwhile, you sort of have what I'd call like an opposition of principle. Like I said with the Nazis, you have when they were going to annex Czechoslovakia, the military planned a coup, and then later on there was a second military one about, I guess, more about method, about how the war was faring, and they felt that the war was going to be lost and they should pursue sort of conciliation and things like that. But you also had the communists who were fighting because they opposed the ideas rather than the methods that those ideas were going for. You had, of course, in the UK during World War II, you had opposition by certain groups like Lord Halifax who wanted more of peace. They thought that the war was lost and all that kind of thing. While you also had factions who were sort of arguing about how the war should be fought, and Churchill believed that if we were to maintain sort of a free world, then we should shut down the press and all that. But of course, the press fought back against that. So you can have all these different kinds of internal oppositions and stuff. Even if you have a faction that's united behind one cause or one party, people who would conventionally say, oh yes, I'm all for this party, could very well start a civil war because they believe that the people that diverge from their interpretation are going to destroy the party or destroy that nation and all that. Or you can alternatively have the opposition who want to destroy the party because they hate that party. There's two different groups there, and I think even if you can't do one, you should pursue the other or consider why either one doesn't exist, because there's very little reason I can ever think of, unless you're a hive mind or something, of either of those existing.
Yeah, definitely. And like even with it, even just having sort of different ideologies meshed together, you don't necessarily have to have a nation that has very differing ideologies in different parts with it be necessarily like in just constant conflict with itself. You've got lots of different ideologies in sort of like Western democracies that are vying for control. They're not necessarily just killing each other in the streets, although, you know, that might change in the next 10 years, but there we are. But you can have all of these different beliefs intermesh and intermingle in the same society, because at the end of the day, you know, people aren't just going to randomly go, I'm a communist, I want a communist nation, and then just march out onto the street and start like butchering people and trying to take over the government. Like, that doesn't happen. People have their beliefs, but they also like stability. You know, you're not going to like it if one day, you know, you're just not going to throw away your entire life of, you know, having a secure job, a secure income. You have, you know, your family and, you know, a wife and kids, and everything's all secure, and you've got your own house now. You're not just going to randomly decide, oh, I actually quite like this ideology that I've seen posted on 4chan. I'm going to go and, you know, like try and coup the government and implement this and throw away my stable, cushy life. You know, that isn't the case. People tend to only really get physically violent and disruptive when things really start affecting their lives on a daily basis. So, you know, prices of food and the like going up to the point where it's kind of unsustainable and people are starting to starve, or people's families being sent off to a conflict and then getting like killed en masse, and, you know, they don't really have any say on being able to sort of end or do whatever in the conflict. You know, like things like that. It just, you can have different ideologies mesh, but not necessarily be in in constant conflict. So yeah.
I'd also say, sort of on top of that, like a good way of defining that is, even with extremist groups in a lot of countries, to the point, you know, where they're going on demonstrations with open carries, or, you know, with bike locks and bats and all Molotovs and all that kind of stuff, and vandalizing. Even in those most extreme cases in the modern day world, none of them really intend to go out and get themselves killed or forcefully take over a government or something. They're just trying to make a point in that case. There's the level of how violent opposition gets and how disruptive they become. I would say can be sort of moved like on like a pulley or something, depending on how much that society or that group feels like their life is already in jeopardy. If someone in modern day is really diehard communist, who thinks that the capitalist system is absolutely awful and he'd love a communist system and all that, he's not going to go out on the street and start shooting people until he gets it or whatever. If he's like, flipping burgers at McDonald's and making a wage that at least gives him a house or a rented house, he'll probably hate the system, but he's not going to say, oh, my life is worth just dying instantly because it's a better trade-off or something like that. He probably isn't going to do that because there's a sense of pointlessness and there's a sense of it's okay. It's better to just make arguments and stuff than go out because I'm not going to die tomorrow or the day before next week or whatever. So in that context, they wouldn't. But if you're in Weimar Germany, in which your week's entire diet depends on like 2 slices of bread and an ounce of horse meat or something like that, chances are, and also you're in the middle of a war that's being lost and you feel like the Allies are about to take over anyway and they're just sending you to your death, you're not going to take orders on suicide missions. You're probably not going to go to the factories. And eventually, when people stop going to the factories and realize that the state can't do anything about that because they're so weakened and all that, because of the very situation that you're starving in or whatever, you're going to start rising up and all that. That's not the Weimar Republic, of course. That's not Imperial Germany, but I sort of broke off from that. But yeah, my point is, it's an escalation. People, just because they have an extreme view in a stable state, don't suddenly start going, oh, yes, it's time for a revolution. It's an escalation of the context that they're in.
Definitely. So does anyone have any sort of questions on the likes of how to create internal conflicts and how things can be changed and how conflicting ideologies can interact and mesh? Does anyone have any sort of particular questions on that? Cool. So the last one, and I will let Victor take over for this because it's his favourite. Unique and serious ideologies, because we have made some ourselves.
Oh, unique and serious ideologies. Okay. Most unique and serious ideologies are shaped by the fact that it's a space future and that the material conditions of the people have changed and people have political projects about how to adapt to that. So, for example, people live way longer. Just like medical immortality is pretty much a given, and you've got like cognitive augmentations, and people are cyborgs and whatever. So there's an ideology called Strixism or Zenithism in general that has said, okay, if people are capable of producing so much more, then why do we still work in these like old schedules? Why does the 8-hour workday still exist when we can produce something much more? So the idea behind Zenithism is to adapt the workload to this sort of new capability of humans in a series. And that is applied differently depending on the country which has adopted it. So usually the countries that have adopted it so far are countries that need to develop pretty quickly. So like Illuminaria got destroyed during the Merdef War, or Capital got ruined during the like 2AW and the Celebra insurgency. So they're countries that need to catch up fast to the rest of the galaxy, or else they'll just become total war countries forever. So they say, okay, we're gonna expand the work regimen, and we're also gonna put in place, say, like a sort of a safety net, like a social safety net, to make sure that like people are working so intensely, they're not just gonna go crazy. They're not gonna lose their mind by working 16 hours a day in a cubicle. And this like ties into something that I don't feel like I touched, but it's really important when it comes to space ideologies and playing interesting countries, which is that regardless of what your ruling ideology is, you're probably gonna have sub factions of it that are all in power. So you've got your your sort of mainstream people who believe in the common version of the ideology. Then you've got your more pragmatist people who are they basically don't care about the ideology, and just use it as a vehicle for political power. And like the same person, if it will be like if it's a fascist country, he'll pretend to be like this super fascist and true believer. But the moment that the country itself becomes communist, then he's gonna pretend that he believed in communism all along. So that's sort of more your pragmatist people who only care about being in power. Then you've got the reformist people. If your idea is pretty radical, there's usually like a couple people trying to like tone it down, integrate more with the other countries of the galaxy, and sort of reduce its more extreme sort of representations. And then you've got the opposite, which is the idealist, the person who fully believes in the ideology. And these people usually think that the main government doesn't go far enough. So you've got your country, and then you're gonna have your people who believe in an even more extreme version of the country, and are gonna be like more true to the ideas of the country than the country itself. So, for instance, when it comes to this made-up ideology of Zenithism, you've got people who say, "Okay, we only need to do this for 20 years. Then we'll catch up to the rest of the economy, and we'll like go back to living like we did before." Then you've got the pragmatist part of Zenithism, which is just people who are in it for the political power and don't have much beliefs of themselves. Then you've got a more reformist current that says, okay, Zenithism goes too far. We can't just completely like drain people's humanity away. We need to tone this down and to establish like a better rest regimens. We need to give people more free days and just gradually phase out this ideology of Zenithism. Then you've got the sort of true believer, the orthodox, who says Zenithism doesn't go far enough. We need to completely reshape human existence so that we can only think about work, and work and leisure just sort of blend into the same thing. And for example, capital is like kind of idealist and kind of pragmatist. Illuminati is much more pragmatist. They're just using Zenithism as a tool. And you can have like moderate Zenithism, I guess, like Ranksy does, or like less extreme versions of it. Zenithism, like usually whenever you have an ideology pop up like that, you get a reaction. You get people that say, "No, I hate this. I'm going to do the opposite." And in the case of Zenithism, it's an ideology that's called surrealism, which says people are only like people stop being human when they sort of start acting along routines. If you just get used to doing commuting to your job every day, and if you get used to like what just sitting in front of a keyboard all day, like doing Excel sheets and whatever, you basically just become a meat robot, and you lose your humanity, and that's a bad thing. The only place where you're actually being you and not just pretending to be someone else is when you're surprised and when you don't have when you don't have a cliche that you can fall back into to react to something. So the goal of society should be to surprise people, to just be constantly changing and constantly adapting, so that people can like are basically forced to express themselves. And they are extremely opposed to Zenithism because they think that Zenithism just turns people into robots, like I said. And within surrealism, you've got people who will say, okay, maybe we should just have put money in developing the arts. Maybe we should just subsidize our film industry. Maybe we should just give people more free time so that they can engage in creative endeavors. Then you've got the extremists of those people who are saying, no, nothing in the state should ever like stay the same. Everything should be constantly changing. Laws should be completely different. One day we should be fascist, one day we should be communist, just so that people have no time to adapt at all. And yeah, you've got also a sort of single issue ideologies and series. Like some people hate hive minds, some people like hive minds, some people think that hive minds are the sort of superior being, and that individuals are just parasites. You've got ideas around whether AIs are people or not, whether respawning should count you as the same people. And you've got combinations of those issues that result in ideologies of their own.
Yeah, I think that covers a lot of the sort of like anchor ideologies that we've done up. In that, I guess it's pretty much a case of you can create your own ideologies just based off like context and situations, based around sort of like the world building situation. So
Yeah,
if you do,
usually like the best ideologies are the ones that where you just completely ignore real life ideologies and you just think, okay, my country is like this. What sort of political issues would there be? And what combinations of issues would give me new ideologies?
yeah, pretty much organically creating them out of the context of what's happening in character, rather than, oh well, I'm going to develop something like communism or like whatever from IRL. But I think that pretty much covers all of the topics. So, do you guys have like any questions in general for ideology stuff, or yeah, now is your time, or forever hold your peace? I see. Oh, yep, go for it.
So it's something I see a lot in. It's not necessarily an ideology in itself, but it's something I see a lot in countries with meme ideologies. Is that people within the whatever country literally cannot fathom having any other method or system or leader other than the one they have now, or they are vehemently against it. It's one thing if it's like, Cold War America where everyone hates communism and anyone who's communist is literally Satan, but like any other ideology is just seen as like, I don't know, insert bad thing here.
Yeah, like, you pretty much want to stay away from that as much as possible, because unless you are a hive mind, there's going to be deviation because people are going to think differently. And even if you do play a hive mind, I mean, we've got instances in Anserios where stuff has happened that's caused hive minds trauma, and as such, they've actually had, like, I guess what you would call in a normal person, like personality disorders that have then sort of, I guess, broken off to become their own thing, or at least a second voice within said hive mind. So, even if you are playing a super mega homogenous nation, such as a hive mind, there are still plenty of options available to you to create a sort of ideology for this hive mind, but then also have different like takes on it. I mean, you could have a super AI which has a particular goal, and it's not entirely sure how it's going to attain that goal. So it will create several sub AIs, which are, for all intents and purposes, itself, but they are all also distinct, to try and argue, or maybe to conduct whatever different aspects and ways that this goal could be attained in their own way, independently, and then analyze those results, and then assess and go with whichever one is more efficient. So it is a case where, yeah, big mega homogenous, everyone thinks the same way is just absolutely cancer, regardless of the situation, and there's always ways to make interesting ideologies and differences in opinion. And yeah, Cora, it's definitely a way of look at the context of your nation and go from there.
I think that's the best way to build the ideologies and oppositions and stuff within your faction, is first to understand, just map out the things that happened, map out your current government, map out the culture and the ideas your people believe in. For instance, those builds on the ideas of liberty, which means that in World War II, whatever, the fascist party in Italy, in America, used George Washington as their sort of figurehead. There's this giant painting of George Washington. They use the term liberty a lot, despite being fascist. or like more relevant, you could be am I a native to the galaxy of Ansirius, or am I colonial? It's all these different things that help build an idea of what biases will my factions have, or what will be in their best interests, or what smaller groups or what special interest groups will exist, or what will their gripes be. Italy did not become fascist out of nowhere. It became fascist because they felt like they had been sort of let down in World War One, both by their liberal government and by the international world. It's not, these opposition groups don't just spawn out of nowhere. Utilize the history your nation has to build factions and give them credence and legitimacy, rather than just be biased towards one faction that you really like, and then all the rest sort of just exist and they're really violent and they don't have much reason to exist at all.
Sure. Okay, so Romando brings up an interesting question. Would declaring war on a country because of their ideology, e.g. like crusading, be a viable option to changing the target country's ideology? I mean, if you're going to take over a nation, you are probably going to need to puppet its government. So, irregardless of what's going on, you're probably going to be changing the country's ideology from, like, one standpoint, irregardless if you're actually trying to or not. I mean, just look at post-World War II Germany, where, the Allies went in and they effectively, divvied everything up, created new governments, tried to push it in a different ideological direction. I would not say that it is a valid casus belli to just be like, I'm a big democracy. However, this big evil communist over here needs to be destroyed because they think differently to me. I don't think that's a valid casus belli at all, and a legitimate reason to go to war. I would say that it's a legitimate reason for that nation to try and influence the other nation through economic, political, subversive activities to try and maybe help other factions within that government to change, and change it for, this other nation's interests. But yeah, I've never been a fan of, like, crusading as a concept, and I've always seen it as kind of like a meme. Trying to change ideology on an individual level of a country, yeah, that would be pretty difficult, I think. And it would probably take several generations, at least.
Say on top of that, with what Myrick was saying, I think, personally, in my view, you can invade some countries on ideological, but it really depends on the context. Like, there are some countries in history that were invaded to install democracies, but these were really small places. Like, I think it was the invasion of Grenada by the Americans happened, and that was to change the government from communism to democracy. But the reason why that happened was Grenada was an extremely small country. It basically had no military. It was unprotected, really, by the Soviets. Even then, it had advisors and stuff being sent to them to make life difficult for the Americans. And it was basically there's nothing to lose from it. But more relevantly, I think everyone sort of agrees that America is sort of very much intervening in other countries to install new ideologies. Yet, Myanmar's recently got rid of its civilian government. They don't have any nuclear weapons, but they have a big conventional military, and they don't have pretty much any resources that can be gained from getting a friendly government there. And it's very aligned with China's geopolitical situation. Has America invaded Myanmar, to establish a friendly government there? The United States hasn't, because it doesn't have any ulterior gains to it aside from changing to a friendly government, which itself might not be worth it if the people aren't willing to vehemently rebel themselves. And if they have vehemently rebelled against the authoritarian regime, then all you have to do is not declare war, you just have to send guns to them. It's like that. Or did they declare war on the Soviet Union? Optionally, no. Did they declare war on Nazi Germany? They probably might have, like, eventually, but they only declared war when they're already starting to lose, and when Germany declared war on them, because Japan obviously attacked. It's very rarely attack someone for the sake of changing ideology, because it means you're going to have to attack. You're going to have to go into debt with all that kind of things. You're banking on the fact that the locals will want that ideology change and won't be bogged down with it. There's a lot to gain resource-wise, so make it worthwhile of getting that country to be friendly to your ideology. It requires all that kind of logistics. It requires your population to be supportive of it. Look at the Vietnam War and why that began to end. It requires all these different kinds of things. So you can't. It's a really contextually circumstantial thing to attack purely for the goal of ideology change.
Yeah, I'd say that was really well put. Any other questions at all before we wrap this up? This has been quite a long one, actually.
It has. I've waffled a lot.
How much would theology affect the government? Or ideology? Well, as Victor said earlier, like, it depends on what institutions are propping up that particular government or ideology. So if you do have a nation that is very, that's institutions like the church, for example, are very powerful and can mobilize large groups of supporters, if they are the center of that sort of nation, then you are going to have, you know, as I said, like, you know, Christian democracy or a theological, you know, state, authoritarian state or whatever, because that's going to be what the church is going to be pushing for. So,
yeah, if theology and sort of religion dominate your country, then they will really influence your government and ideology. And it doesn't necessarily have to be its own. Iran, I'm pretty sure, is a democracy, but because of how Islamic it is, it's a theology at the same time. So it's an Islamic republic, I'm pretty sure.
yeah.
And its leader is sort of fused with being the religious leader. In a fascist case, you see that Franco came to power and he had one of his key support beams was the Christian and the Catholic Church and all that kind of thing. So was Mussolini to a degree. So that was because of the theological context to those countries. And I can't think of any sort of spiritual, sort of theological countries that were socialist, but you do have Christian socialism as an idea because of the sort of theological background to Christianity and the idea of Jesus being against money and against greed and all that kind of thing, which was fused by the church and many sorts of religious people in Catholicism, in Protestantism and stuff, and fusing religion with communism to create this Christian socialist fusion. So yes, theology really does affect your government and how it's built, but it's a separate thing, I think, to ideology itself.
It's one of the foundational pillars that will help shape your ideology, but it's not an ideology in it. It's like the monarch. It's like monarchism, as we were talking about. It's not an ideology as it's in itself, but it can be like a major pillar of an ideology, depending on the context of your nation. Anything else? Oh man.
I think that is it.
Okay. Well, I hope that will help some people, and we shall leave it there for the evening. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Hey.